She married a 70-year-old man at 12. His secret changed her life forever. In a sun-scorched town on the edge of nowhere, 12-year-old Lila, a girl with calloused feet and hollow cheeks, stood trembling as her fate was sealed. She was married off to Harold Grayson, a silver-haired 70-year-old tycoon whose wealth gleamed brighter than the cracked dirt streets she'd known all her life. The air was thick with desperation, the kind that chokes a family when hope runs dry. Her younger brother, Milo, lay burning with fever, his shallow breaths counting down the hours in a shack too poor to afford even a whisper of medicine. The local clinic turned them away. Cash or nothing. Her mother had already pawned every scrap of dignity, from her rusted cooking pot to the threadbare shawl Lila once called her own. Harold swept in like a shadow across the dunes, a stranger from a distant city, his suitcase stuffed with crisp bills and his eyes carrying a cold, unreadable weight. He didn't haggle or preach. He just laid out the deal. Marriage for a price that could buy Milo's life and a year's worth of meals. Lila's mother wept, her fists pounding the earth, but as Milo's coughs turned to rasps, defiance crumbled into silence. Lila, barely old enough to braid her own hair, muttered, "I'll go." The wedding was a hollow echo. Her in a borrowed dress that scratched her skin, him in a tailored suit that swallowed the light, and a crowd too ashamed to cheer. That night, alone in his polished guest house, Lila clutched Milo's faded toy truck, her heart pounding with a question she couldn't yet voice. What did this man want? And why did his kindness feel like a trap waiting to spring? In the dim glow of a sprawling coastal mansion perched atop cliffs that overlooked a restless sea, 12-year-old Mara, still reeling from the strange wedding that had tethered her to Victor Caldwell, a 70-year-old widower with deep pockets and deeper silences, found herself caught in a web of confusion spun by his unexpected gentleness. The air inside the house smelled of salt and polished wood, a stark contrast to the fish-stink shanties of her old life, where she'd bartered clamshells for bread and nursed her brother through nights of fevered delirium. Victor, with his gray eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he poured her tea, didn't fit the mold of the leering old men she'd been warned about by the women in her village. The ones who'd whispered of bruised wrists and stolen youth when they thought she couldn't hear. Instead, he moved around her like she was a guest, not a bride, setting out plates of warm bread with butter, pointing her to a room with a bed softer than anything she'd ever touched, and speaking in a voice so low it barely broke the hum of the ocean outside. He didn't demand, didn't touch, didn't even linger when he bid her good night, retreating to a separate wing of the house with a soft click of a lock that left Mara staring at the ceiling, her mind buzzing with questions she didn't know how to ask. Why bring her here if not to claim her? Why fill her days with quiet kindness, books with pages yellowed at the edges, a pair of shoes that didn't pinch, a bowl of soup steaming on the table, when the village had painted him as a predator in a pressed suit? Each act chipped away at her fear, but it built something else in its place, a gnawing suspicion that coiled tighter with every passing hour. The strangeness grew thicker as the days stretched on, the mansion's high walls and endless corridors swallowing time like the tide took the shore. Victor didn't raise his voice or his hand, didn't leer or loom. He sat across from her at breakfast with a newspaper folded neatly beside his plate, asking her if she liked the jam, as if she were a niece visiting for the summer. He gave her a sketchbook one morning, the leather cover smooth under her salt-roughened fingers, and said, "Draw what you see," in a tone that wasn't a command but an invitation, his eyes flicking away before she could read them. Mara, who'd spent her life dodging the fists of drunk fishermen and the scorn of neighbors who called her mother weak, didn't know what to make of it. She'd expected chains, not charcoal pencils, and the freedom of it, the way he left her alone to wander the house, to trace the outlines of gulls through the window, felt like a trick, a baited hook waiting to snag. Nights were the worst, when the silence pressed in and she'd lie awake, clutching the frayed ribbon she'd worn at the wedding, wondering if his gentleness was just a mask hiding something uglier, something the village had tried to prepare her for but couldn't name. She watched him from corners, studied the way he lingered over his coffee or stared out at the waves, his face creasing with a tiredness that didn't match his wealth, and the mystery of him grew heavier, a shadow she couldn't shake. Then came the fifth night, when the wind howled louder than usual and Mara, barefoot and restless, slipped down a hallway she hadn't explored before, drawn by a faint light spilling from beneath a door Victor always kept shut. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she pressed her palms against the cool wood, the knob unyielding until she found a pin in her pocket and worked it into the lock, her breath catching as it gave way. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory, the walls lined with photographs of girls, dozens of them, some with braids, some with scars, their faces frozen in black and white moments she didn't understand. A table in the corner held stacks of letters, yellowed envelopes with names scrawled in Victor's careful hand. To Priya. I hope the paints found you well. To Elena. The school should be finished by now. To Mara. You'll see soon enough. Her name jolted her like a slap, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the note, the ink still fresh, the words a riddle wrapped in a goodbye. She stumbled back, heart hammering, as footsteps echoed behind her. And there he was, Victor, framed in the doorway, his coat damp from the storm outside, his expression not anger but exhaustion. I suppose you had to know sometime, he said, his voice a threadbare whisper. And Mara clutched the letter, her eyes wide with a question that burned brighter than ever. What kind of man collected girls like ghosts? And why had he chosen her to haunt? Beneath the flickering gas lamps of a crumbling port city, where the air hung heavy with coal dust and the cries of gulls tangled with the shouts of dockworkers, 12-year-old Tessa stood frozen as Victor Ramsey, the enigmatic 70-year-old recluse who'd claimed her as his bride, peeled back the layers of his bewildering kindness to reveal a truth that turned her world upside down. The sprawling warehouse he called home loomed over the waterfront, its rusted walls a far cry from the sodden alley where Tessa had once scavenged for scraps to feed her sister, Clara, whose lungs rattled with every breath in a tenement too broke to buy coal for warmth. Victor had swept into her life like a storm off the harbor, his pockets lined with cash and his gaze sharp with something she couldn't place, offering a deal that promised Clarice medicine in exchange for a ring on Tessa's finger, a bargain her mother had choked on but couldn't refuse. For days, Tessa had tiptoed through his world, braced for cruelty that never came, her suspicion growing with every gentle word, every plate of food he set before her without a price attached. Until that night in the locked room, when the photographs and letters spilled his secret into the dim light. He'd caught her there, wrist deep in his past, and instead of rage, he'd sighed, a sound that carried the weight of decades, and sat her down on a crate. His voice steady as he spoke of a mission she hadn't seen coming, one that stretched far beyond the salt-crusted streets she knew. Victor leaned against the wall, the lantern casting shadows across his lined face, and told her he hadn't married her for himself, but for her, to shield her from a fate she didn't even know was closing in. He said he'd heard whispers down at the docks, tales of a slick-haired man from overseas, a trader in flesh who'd been sniffing around the poorest corners of the city, buying girls younger than Tessa with promises of work that ended in chains. Her family's debts had made her a target, a name on a list Victor had intercepted, and he'd moved fast, wed her quick, because it was the only way to stake a claim the law couldn't ignore. Tessa's stomach twisted as he spoke, her fingers tightening around a letter with her name on it, the words blurring as she tried to fathom a world where a stranger's mercy outran a monster's greed. But that was just the beginning. Victor's story unraveled like a sailor's yarn, spinning back 20 years to when he'd first walked away from a life of boardrooms and brandy, trading suits for shadows as he hunted for girls like her across continents. Girls teetering on the edge of oblivion in places the maps forgot. He'd found them in slums and brothels, in fishing villages and war-torn hills, their eyes hollow but alive, and he'd done what he could, slipped them cash for school, built shacks with clean water, paid off pimps to let them go, always quiet, always alone, a ghost moving through the dark. Tessa sat there, the warehouse creaking around her, as Victor traced the outlines of his past with a voice that cracked only once, when he spoke of the ones he couldn't save. The names scratched out on those photographs, the dates that marked graves instead of birthdays. He wasn't a saint, he said, just a man who'd seen too much, who'd learned that money could buy time but not forgiveness, and that the only way to fight a system that chewed up girls like her was to step into its jaws himself. She asked why he didn't shout it from the rooftops. Build a charity with his fortune. And he laughed, a dry, bitter sound, saying he'd tried once, sold half his empire to fund it, but the law favored the powerful. And the powerful liked their secrets kept. So he'd gone rogue, a one-man war waged in backrooms and bribes. And Tessa was the latest battle. The girl he'd married not to own but to free. Her head spun as he laid it bare. The photos on the wall no longer ghosts but beacons. Each one a life he'd touched. A debt he'd paid. And now her, a pawn-turned-player in a game she hadn't known she was part of. Victor stood, his shadow long against the crates, and said, I bought you time, Tessa, time to choose what they'd have stolen, and in that moment, the weight of his purpose crashed over her, a tide of hope and horror that left her breathless, wondering what kind of man spent his life saving strangers, and why he'd picked her to carry the torch he'd lit, in the shadow of a weathered ranch sprawling across the sunburned plains of a nowhere town, where the wind carried dust and the faint bleat of goats mingled with the hum of cicadas. 12-year-old Juniper felt the ground shift beneath her as Clarence Whitaker, the grizzled 70-year-old cattle baron who'd bound her to him in a hasty marriage, slipped away into a silence that changed everything. The ranch house, with its creaking beams and wide windows framing endless yellow fields, had been her cage and her riddle these past weeks. A place where Clarence's quiet kindness, hot meals left on the table, a quilt draped over her shoulders, a room she didn't have to share, had clashed with the terror she'd carried from her old life. A crumbling shack where her sister, Ivy, coughed blood into a rag and their father sold scraps of metal to keep the wolves at bay. Clarence had ridden into that desperation on a horse shined with money. His hat tipped low and his voice rough but steady, offering a deal that traded Juniper's hand for Ivy's medicine, a lifeline her father couldn't refuse even as he cursed the dirt beneath his boots. She'd braced for the worst, her imagination painting him as a vulture in a Stetson, but instead he'd given her space, a pair of boots that fit, a pencil to scratch out her thoughts, and a locked barn she'd pried open one night, revealing a trove of photographs and letters that whispered of girls he'd pulled from the jaws of ruin, girls like her. Their faces pinned to the walls like stars in a constellation only he could read. That discovery had cracked her fear wide open, and when he'd found her there, his confession spilling out about shielding her from a traitor circling her family's debts, she'd begun to see him not as a captor but a keeper of something bigger. Something she couldn't yet grasp. The morning after that revelation, the ranch felt different, the air heavier, as if it knew what was coming before Juniper did. She'd woken to a stillness that pressed against her chest. The usual clatter of Clarence in the kitchen, boiling coffee, scraping a skillet, replaced by an eerie quiet that sent her padding barefoot across the hardwood. Her pulse quickening with every step, she found him in his room, the door ajar, his broad frame still beneath a faded flannel robe, his face slack and pale against the pillow, the lines of worry smoothed out in a way that told her he wasn't sleeping. Her breath caught, a sob clawing up her throat as she stumbled forward, her hands hovering over him, unsure whether to shake him awake or let him lie. The reality sinking in like a stone through water, he was gone. The doctor came later, a wiry man with a black bag and a grim nod, muttering about heart failure, saying Clarence's ticker had been winding down for months, maybe years, and Juniper remembered the way he'd pause sometimes, hand pressed to his chest, his breath hitching as he stared out at the horizon. He'd known, she realized, known his days were numbered, and that's why he'd moved so fast. Why he'd chosen her, why he'd locked eyes with her in that dusty yard and seen not just a girl but a chance, one last stand against the dark he'd spent decades fighting. She sat there beside him, the room dim with dawn's half-light, her fingers tracing the edge of his blanket as the truth unfurled like a map she hadn't asked for. He'd left her everything, she'd learn soon enough, but it started with a letter she found tucked in his bedside drawer. The paper crisp despite the tremble in his scrawl, addressed to her in a hand that shook with purpose. Juniper, it began, if you're reading this, I've run out of road. But that's all right, I've had my ride. This place, the land, the money, it's yours now, but the real gift ain't in the bank. It's the open door I couldn't give the others. Live free, girl, don't let nobody fence you in. Her eyes stung as she read it. The words blurring through tears she hadn't shed since the wedding. Not out of fear this time, but something rawer. Something that ached with gratitude and loss twisted together. He'd known he was dying. Had felt it creeping up in the quiet moments. And instead of curling into himself, he'd reached out one last time. Plucked her from a fate she hadn't seen coming. A traitor with a greased smile and a ledger full of girls' names. And given her not just a roof but a horizon. The weight of it pressed her down. The ranch sprawling around her like a question she didn't know how to answer yet. Its pastures and barns no longer a prison but a promise she'd have to figure out alone. Word spread slow at first. A murmur among the ranch hands who tipped their hats and avoided her eyes. Then a call to a lawyer in town who rolled up in a dust-caked truck. Clutching a folder thick with papers that named her. Juniper, barely a teenager, the sole heir to Clarence Whitaker's world. The hands whispered, some with awe, some with suspicion, wondering how a scrawny kid from the wrong side of the tracks could inherit a spread that stretched to the sky. But Juniper didn't hear them. She was too busy tracing the edges of his letter. Replaying his voice in her head. The way he'd said, live free, meant she could choose, like it was a challenge she could meet. The lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, sat her down later that day, laying it out plain. The estate was hers. Lock, stock, and barrel, land, savings, cattle, the works, enough to carry her through school and beyond. If she wanted it, you don't have to leave. The woman added, softening a little. Clarence made damn sure you could stay as long as you like. Juniper nodded, the words sinking in slow. Her mind still tangled in the why of it all. Why her? Why now? Why this gift from a man she'd barely known but who'd seen her clear as day? She didn't cry, didn't run, just sat there, the silence loud but not empty. His absence a presence she could feel in the creak of the floorboards. The slant of light through the window. And she wondered if he'd planned it this way. His death not an end but a beginning. A baton passed in a race she hadn't known she was running. Alone in his study that night, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of leather, she clutched that letter, her chest tight with a question that kept her awake. Had he saved her because he had to? Or because he believed no one else would? Amid the rolling hills of a forgotten valley, where the earth cracked under a relentless sun and the air buzzed with the drone of flies over dry creek beds, 12-year-old Sage stood at the threshold of a sprawling ranch house. Its weathered planks and wide porch now hers. A legacy left by Clarence Whitaker, the 70-year-old loner whose death had handed her not just a key but a calling she never saw coming. The days after his passing blurred into a haze of dust and disbelief. Her hands still trembling from the weight of his letter, live free. Girl, as she stepped into a world he'd built. A world she'd once feared. Its barns and pastures stretching out like a canvas she could paint however she chose. She'd come from a tarp-covered lean-to on the edge of town, where her brother, Finn, wheezed through nights of fever, and her mother bartered old clothes for scraps of food. A life so brittle it shattered when Clarence offered his deal, her hand for Finn's survival. She'd expected chains, not choices, but now, with his heart stilled and his fortune signed over, Sage felt the ground shift. The ranch no longer a stranger's shadow but a tool, a weapon, a chance to claw back something from the nothing she'd always known. The lawyer's voice still echoed in her ears, land, cattle, cash, all hers, and with it came a flicker of something fierce. A spark Clarence had lit when he'd confessed his decades-long war to save girls like her from the traitors who prowled the margins. A war she could fight now, not with fists but with the power he'd left behind. It started small, the way change often does, with Sage sitting cross-legged on the porch. Clarence's letter crumpled in her lap, her eyes tracing the horizon as she pieced together what free could mean, not just for her, but for the others she'd seen in town. The girls with hunched shoulders and hollow stares. The ones whispered about in alleys when the men thought no one listened. She called the lawyer back, a woman named Ms. Hale with a clipboard and a no-nonsense squint, and told her to pull money from the accounts, not for dresses or dolls, but for the clinic that had turned Finn away. Its sagging roof and empty shelves a scar on the valley she'd fix first. Ms. Hale raised an eyebrow but nodded, and within weeks, the clinic stood straighter, its walls patched, its cabinets stocked, A sign out front declaring no one would be refused again. A promise Sage scratched into the dirt with her own hands. She didn't stop there. The ranch house, once a silent sprawl of rooms Clarence had roamed alone, began to hum with new life as she opened its doors. Not to tenants or ranch hands, but to girls like her. The ones she'd heard about in hushed tones. Lila, 10. Her arms bruised from an uncle's grip. Rosie, 11. Promised to a man twice her age for a sack of grain. They came wary, their footsteps light on the creaking floors. But Sage met them with soup and a nod. No questions, no demands, just a bed and a chance to breathe. The house turning into a sanctuary under her quiet, steady watch. The valley took notice, slow at first, then all at once. Whispers rippling through the market stalls and the bar where the old men drank sage. The kid who'd married the hermit was doing something big. She dug into Clarence's ledgers, her fingers smudged with ink as she pored over his scribbled notes, and found the cash to build a schoolhouse where the dirt lot used to bake in the sun. A squat building with desks and a chalkboard where she'd once hawked wildflowers to buy Finn a crust of bread. She didn't just stop at bricks, she sat Ms. Hale down again, her voice firm despite the crack in it, and laid out a rule. No girl under 14 could be wed. Not here, not anymore. And she'd set up a ledger of her own, a tally of names and ages, a threat scratched in ink that she'd report any man who tried it to the sheriff 2 towns over. Some spat at the idea, called her a meddler, a fool playing with a dead man's money, but others the mothers who'd lost daughters to early graves. The girls who ducked their father's hands started looking at her different, their eyes catching hers with a flicker of something like fire. The ranch became more than a house, it was a beacon, its lights glowing through the dusk as girls trickled in, some with bags, some with nothing, all finding a corner to call theirs. And Sage moved among them, not a queen or a preacher, but one of them, her hands rough from work, her heart stitched with Clarence's ghost. The change didn't sit quiet, it roared. Eventually, when the valley's edges couldn't hold it anymore, Sage kept Clarence's spirit close, his words about freedom ringing in her ears as she turned his legacy into something alive. Something that bit back. The schoolhouse filled with voices. The clinic saved lives. And the ranch stood as a wall against the old ways, its doors open to any girl who needed them. A promise she'd carved out of the dirt he'd left her. She'd walk the fields sometimes, alone under a sky bruised with stars, and think of him, Clarence, the man who'd seen her when no one else did, who'd died to give her this, and she'd wonder if he'd known she'd take it this far. If he'd trusted her to carry the torch he'd lit. The whispers turned to stories, the stories to shouts, and soon the valley called her something new. The girl who turned a grave into a garden. The one who took a dead man's gold and built a world where girls could stand tall. She didn't speak much, didn't need to. Her actions roared louder. And in the quiet of the ranch at night, surrounded by the soft breaths of the girls she'd sheltered, Sage felt it. She wasn't just living free. She was setting others free too. A legacy not of land or cash, but of fight. A fire Clarence had sparked that she'd never let die. In the dusty sprawl of a border town kissed by sagebrush and kissed harder by hardship. Where the horizon swallowed dreams as fast as it spat out heat. 12-year-old Wren stood at the helm of a crumbling ranch house. Its sagging roof and wide fields now a launchpad for a revolution sparked by the final gift of Silas Hawthorne. The 70-year-old recluse whose death had handed her not just his wealth but his war. She'd come from a tarp-strewn patch of nothing, her sister Lila's coughs echoing through nights too broke for hope, until Silas rode in with cash and a deal, her hand for Lila's life, only to reveal in his last breath that he'd married her to save her from a traitor's chains. Part of a 20-year crusade to rescue girls like her from the shadows. His passing left her everything: land, money, and a locked box she'd pried open one sleepless night, its contents spilling out a list of names, dates, and places. A ledger of monsters he'd tracked across borders, traffickers, officials, men who traded girls like cattle, their sins scribbled in his shaky hand. Wren clutched that list, her heart pounding as she read his final note: burn it down. Wren let the light win, and felt the weight of it settle. Not as a burden but a blade. One she'd wield to cut through the dark he'd fought alone. A fight she'd make loud where he'd been silent. A fight that would echo far beyond the cracked earth she called home. She didn't waste time. The ranch, once a quiet refuge for girls she'd pulled from the valley's grip, became a war room, its kitchen table buried under maps and letters as Wren, with Ms. Carter, the sharp-eyed lawyer Silas had trusted, pieced together his dossier into something unstoppable, the Hawthorne Files. A blazing exposé of child marriage rings stretching from dusty towns to gleaming capitals. Naming names that made men in suits sweat. She started local, her voice soft but steel-edged as she stood in the town square, reading out the crimes Silas had documented, her words carrying on the wind until they hit a reporter from the city. A wiry woman with a recorder who turned Wren's story into ink that bled across headlines. Girl 12 inherits ranch and a revolution. The files went viral, shared from screens to streets, and Wren grew taller in the chaos, her quiet fury a beacon as she pushed for laws to choke the trade. Her testimony in a courtroom 2 states over banning marriages under 16. Her name whispered in halls she'd never seen. The world listened. By 14, she spoke at a summit in New York, her boots still dusted with ranch dirt, her words shifting policies in 4 countries. By 15, she'd turned Silas's list into arrests, traffickers hauled off in cuffs, their empires crumbling under the light she'd lit. The ranch stayed her anchor, its doors wide for girls who stumbled in, their eyes wide with the same fear she'd once carried. But now it was more a hub where survivors stitched their stories into hers, where teachers and quiet donors Silas had known poured in, funding schools and shelters that bore her name, Wren Hawthorne. No longer just a kid from nowhere but a voice that roared. Threats came. Letters. Hacks. Men in dark cars. But they were too late. Silas had left her proof. A plan. An army of the broken who stood tall. And Wren wielded it all. Her soft drawl a hammer when she faced down ministers or typed out pleas that millions shared. By 16, she walked back to her town alone. No guards. Just her, standing by the school she'd built. Girls laughing around her, their futures hers to guard. And she smiled, telling them, I used to hide. Now I speak. And the silence breaks. The world knew her, not as a bride or a victim, but a force. And she felt Silas in the breeze. His fight hers now, unstoppable. What do you think? Can one girl change it all? Drop a comment, hit like if Wren's fire lit yours. Subscribe for more stories that shake the dark. And share this to keep the light burning.